if you weren't familiar with her and her game before Tuesday night, you gotta learn the name. I mean, they got completely screwed on that call. You do have the goalie and the defense to support that. This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Alright, what's up guys? Welcome in to this episode. There's a couple things I want to do with this episode. It's been a couple of weeks since I've been able to put out an episode, so there's a couple things that I want to get my thoughts and my feelings out there about. One of them is going to be specific later on in the show. We'll get to this. One of them is going to be specific to Mac Lacrosse and Mac Women's Lacrosse. That's the Mid-American Conference here in the Midwest. You guys know that I'm a Michigan guy here. And also kind of the state of Michigan as well, right? So talking like U of M, Eastern Michigan, Detroit Mercy, Central Michigan, those kinds of things. Like I said, the MAC really heavy into that. Top of the show here in just a few minutes, I've got a topic that I want to get to with women's lacrosse. It's something that this past Sunday in calling the game between Eastern Michigan and Youngstown State, their play-by-play guy had asked me this during the broadcast on ESPN+, so of course I went ahead and gave my thoughts on that, so I'll tell you what that was here in just a little bit. But the thing I want to start out with to kind of lead us into this episode is the Big Ten. I'd say definitely made some headlines over this past weekend in college lacrosse. You talk the first one being on Saturday. Michigan knocks off Maryland for the fourth consecutive win for them in that matchup. And it was really funny for me going on social media after that game. I unfortunately didn't get to watch that game. But for me as a Michigan fan, seeing some of the comments on social media after that game and people saying, you know, does Maryland have a Michigan problem maybe right now? And for me, it's kind of funny because that just made me think a lot about the current situation, I guess you would say, with the rivalry between Michigan and Ohio State in football, where a lot of people have been saying that very same thing almost about Ohio State and Ryan Day is like, do they have a quote unquote Michigan problem? Because, you know, Ryan Day has a really good record against the rest of the Big Ten and, you know, most other schools that they face typically. And then all of a sudden, you know, he's got that 4 straight losses to Michigan thing kind of hanging over him right now. Sure, the national championship this past season does help, but, you know, the matter of fact still remains with those 4 straight losses to Michigan. So I did think it was kind of funny that a lot of people after that game against Maryland on Saturday were kind of saying that similar thing is like, do they have a Michigan problem? And some people were saying, you know, it could be maybe is it a matchup thing or whatever. And I do think maybe it is potentially somewhat of a matchup thing. Like maybe Michigan just plays a certain way or has a certain style that might be a little bit tougher to match up with than maybe some other teams that you would see Maryland playing, right? So maybe it's more of a matchup thing maybe. And one thing I kind of wonder too, like from maybe a psychological or like a mental standpoint, not that necessarily Michigan or, you know, Coach Connery's like in their heads or anything like that. I don't mean that psychologically, but Connery did coach under Tillman for at least a couple of years there before coming over and taking over the head coaching job at Michigan. So I almost wonder, does Connery maybe know how Tillman thinks, right? Like, does he know how he thinks? Does he know what buttons he'll push in certain situations, right? So I'm wondering maybe if it's something psychological like that where Connery is just able to get inside the head of John Tillman and maybe try to think maybe 1 or 2 steps ahead of him like that. But I do think maybe, going back to what I said before, it could definitely be a matchup problem, because to use that Michigan-Ohio State comparison again is a lot of what Michigan does right in football, just the style that they play right on the line of scrimmage and things like that. A lot of that has to do with their success in recent years against Ohio State. So yeah, maybe it is something schematically that Michigan does against Maryland. that's kind of giving them somewhat of an edge right now. And then the other thing that happened over this weekend, probably even more so bigger than that Michigan Maryland matchup, was the Penn State Ohio State game, that blown review in that game. And I'm not going to go into a whole deep dive on this. I originally was planning to, but I'm not going to do too much of a deep dive with this at this point. But just the missed call in that game, and it's not that the call was necessarily missed. I mean, it ended up having pretty much no impact on the final outcome of the game anyway, but it's more so the fact that where we are at this day and age with technology and different things like that, and the capabilities that we have, that the broadcast clearly had all these different angles and whatnot, and we see those at home, but to hear that the officials apparently didn't have the ability or the access to those specific angles, and they had like a totally different camera angle, it sounded like, outside of what we even see on the broadcast. And from what I had seen, somebody posted a screenshot of it on social media, a piece of an article that was written about it, was that the camera angle kind of sucked, right? Like I remember seeing that they said it was like way up high and you almost couldn't even really see anything to begin with, let alone tell whether it was a goal or not. So the camera angle that they did have access to, I guess, wasn't really all that great. So it kind of makes me wonder, like, how are we at this point in this day and age with technology where first it was we wanted review, then we got it, and now we have review, but the review process isn't great, right? Like, it could definitely use some help or some upgrading or whatever, because, I know from calling basketball games at the NAIA level, they just instituted replay as well at even that level. And for the school that I do it at here in Michigan, they use the actual physical broadcast feed that I'm personally working on to do the replays over at the scorers table. So it's like, if we can make that happen at the NAIA level for basketball, like, why can't we do that for Division I, right? Like, why is that not just how it's always done? Because you've got 4 or 5 different camera angles all going at one time, and we can see those at home, but why are the officials kind of blocked from being able to see those in real time when they're doing these reviews, and they have to use these camera angles, kind of like what you see with the camera angle at Maryland, where it basically looks like they're filming it from outer space. Like, it just, to me, does not make sense, and it almost makes the official's job in that situation impossible. And I know Matt Palem and his crew caught some heat for that call over the weekend. And again, like, it does make their jobs really hard to do when you're giving them kind of a crappy product, I guess, to work with in that situation, right? It's like they can only do so much. So that's kind of just how I wanted to get into this episode with. Like I said, we're going to do a little bit of women's lacrosse here in just a second and touch on the Mid-American Conference later on. And what I wanted to get to with that first off is, in that game, like I said, I did the Eastern Michigan and Youngstown State game this past Sunday on ESPN+. Eastern Michigan broadcaster Tom Helmer asked me this at one point during the second half of the game. He asked me about the possibility of eventually the women's players being in pads similar to the men, and he asked for my thoughts on it, and he also asked Eastern Michigan coach, who was also a guest not that long ago on the show, in Maddie Dugan, also former Detroit Mercy head coach last year. He asked her this question during pregame, and quite honestly, she just came out right and said, this is literally a direct quote from her, said, "I hope it never comes to that." And I honestly agree. I mean, this is something that, in my response to him on Sunday, that not in so many words as what I'm about to get into, but basically I told him, yeah, I completely agree with that. I don't think it's really all that necessarily, because I do think there's something beautiful about every form of lacrosse, whether it be, women's field, men's field, box lacrosse, sixes, right? I'd even go as far as to say even something as silly as speed lacrosse, right? Like to me, there's something unique, I think, about every form of lacrosse, and I've even said this before, I don't think that it has to be a this or that situation where you can only be a fan of or you can only enjoy one form of it, and that's why I've never gotten the whole kind of PLL versus NLL thing, because to me it's just like, why does that matter? But that's not what I want to get into with this segment at all. I'm just kind of making that comparison, but I do think that when it comes to the whole them playing in pads thing, that I think the rule changes from a couple of years ago in women's college lacrosse, where you've seen they went back a couple of years ago and they made some adjustments to try to help, I think, the pace of play within women's lacrosse, and I think that those have definitely made a difference, because I broadcasted for a year or so before they made those rule changes, and then I've broadcasted obviously for a number of years since they made those rule adjustments, and I can honestly tell you that by comparison, that first year that I did before those rule changes were instituted, by comparison, that pre-adjustment season kind of feels like paint drying compared to what it is now. I mean, sure, they could, I think, still maybe make some further adjustments possibly in the way that some of those rules are carried out and officiated in game, but I think, again, by comparison, it's almost night and day how much more smooth the game feels and how much faster it feels like the game moves along, which is exactly what those rule changes were meant to do, and that's what I told Tom Helmer in that game on Sunday. And I think it even goes back to when I talked last month during the championship series about the WLL adding the 2-point arc, and then everybody started saying, well, if you do that, then you got to put them in helmets at the very least and things like that to try to protect them, and I'm all for player safety and keeping these players safe and healthy and all that, and that's why I think that this right now with what we have with women's lacrosse is probably the best version of it. And I believe I said this to him as well on Sunday during the broadcast, is that this version of where we are at with the women's game right now is probably the best version that we're ever going to get without taking it to an extreme where we are putting them in helmets and are putting them in pads and doing things like that. So I think at this point in time, try to let them play, which is something that I think that Athletes Unlimited did a really nice job of, is let the athletes play, but just not do it in pads. That's all I'm saying. So coming up in segment 2, like I said, I'll finish out the show kind of doing a deep dive into the Mid-American Conference for women's lacrosse, and also touching on just the state of Michigan, I think, in general, and kind of where I'm at with it and my thoughts and feelings are on it, because to kind of give you a little preview to that segment, I'm pretty high on it right now, and that's why I'm going to get into it coming up next on Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. All right, welcome back into Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, second and final segment of this show. Been a couple weeks since I've gotten around to getting an episode in, so glad to be able to get this one in. And what I want to do with this is, like I said, it's going to be a lot of talk about the MAC for women's lacrosse, as now I represent two of the teams really in that conference, in Detroit Mercy and most recently doing some color commentary with Eastern Michigan, which I'm really excited about. I've got 2 more games with them later on this spring, one of which coming up in about a week and a half from now on April 6th And that's going to be a special one for sure. That's going to be Detroit Mercy actually going to Eastern Michigan for that game. So it'll be kind of cool. It's like the two teams that I represent now kind of going at it in that one. So really excited for that one. But I think just taking a look at lacrosse right now in this state in general, I mean, you look at the University of Michigan. Michigan men are the two-time defending Big Ten tournament champions. Just came off, as we talked top of the show, just came off of beating number one Maryland this past weekend, fourth straight win against the Terps in that series. And then the women have been highly rated, it seems like, all season this year. Believe they actually got into the top 10 at one point earlier on this season. And even dating back to last season, I remember there was a game they had against, I believe it was Maryland last year in Ann Arbor, where that game was two undefeated teams ranked 1 and 2 nationally in the rankings. So, I mean, just you look at those two programs and where they've been and how far they've gone, I think just in the last 2-3 years. I mean, you look at the men, and I think they've come a very long way just since I did a couple games for them on BTN Plus back during the 2021 Big Ten only season that they did that year, kind of coming out of COVID that season. So yeah, I think they've absolutely come a long way, even just in the last 2, 3, 4 years on both the men's and women's side. And like I said, being that I cover a lot of MAC women's lacrosse these last 6-7 years or so, talking with head coach for Eastern Michigan, Maddie Dugan, on that episode a couple months ago, she said it best. The MAC this year was expected to be, and I think is at this point in time, as open as it's ever been, because historically in the couple of years that the MAC has been around with women's lacrosse, typically it's been Central Michigan and Robert Morris have kind of dominated the conference and have consistently been those top two teams year in and year out. But now you look at this year, and there's a lot more, I think, parity within the league, and I think you're going to see a lot more shakeup at the top of the standings as the top 4 teams in those final standings make the MAC tournament. And you look at a team like the Akron Zips, right? Typically, I would say probably one of the teams down near the bottom of the conference most years. They're already out to a 2-0 start in conference play. One of those wins just this past weekend against Central Michigan. Then you look at a team like Detroit Mercy that, again, typically kind of hovering around the middle of the pack, maybe lower part of the conference, I'll admit. But they went to the title game last year, knocking off number 1 seed Central Michigan, and took on Robert Morris in the championship game. Picked up a come-from-behind win this past weekend on Sunday to start out 1-0 in the conference. They will get Akron this coming Sunday at home, so you can check me out there on ESPN Plus doing that game. So again, just a positive start to conference play for them. They've got Eastern Michigan, as I mentioned earlier on in the show, coming up in a few weeks. And Eastern Michigan as a program is in a really good place, I think, too, in just their 3rd season of competition. I think you got to give a ton of credit to now former head coach Sarah Tisdale, who started that program and then just this past off season went and took the job over at Florida State to begin their program down there. And then what does Eastern do? Oh, they turn the program over to the reigning MAC Coach of the Year in Coach Dugan, coming over from Detroit Mercy. And on top of that, they have the last 2 freshmen of the year in Mackenzie Blackwell and Maddie Porter from 2023 and 2024. So again, just the depth of this conference, I think, is, as Coach Dugan described it to me in that episode going back a few months ago, is as open or as deep as it's really ever been. And I think that for me, sort of the bottom line in that is that it's such a great thing for the sport here in the Midwest and the state of Michigan in specific, because the more competitive, the more open, whatever you want to call it, that this conference can become on a consistent basis, where it's not just Central Michigan and Robert Morris kind of dominating the conference, but you do get an Akron that jumps out to a 2-0 start in conference play, or you do get a Detroit Mercy that finds their way into the conference championship game, right? In Eastern Michigan, kind of really building up their program as quickly as they've been able to do. Like, when you can have that and you can build this conference into just consistently seeing how competitive and how open, like I said, that it can be, I think it's just going to be such a great thing for lacrosse here in the Midwest, and for women's lacrosse, I think, in general. So that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. You can find the show pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts, including Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Odyssey as well. Again, just about anywhere that you get your podcasts, but that'll do it for me. I'll talk to you guys later.